In a Fan Friday edition of Locked On Broncos, we asked the question, will the Denver Broncos overhaul their entire offensive philosophy in the 2023 NFL season? On top of that, will interim head coach Jerry Rosburg be a consideration for the potential head coaching job next year? And should the Broncos invest in the trenches on the offensive line and defensive line in the NFL draft? These are some of the questions we received from avid listeners all across Broncos country. You get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch us on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button if you've not done so already, so you never miss a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long. We have you covered from the south stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange. Sayre, we're just about 72 hours away from the Broncos kicking things off against the Kansas City Chiefs in an AFC West showdown. Obviously, in an emotional-filled week for this team with the dismissal of Nathaniel Hackett as the head coach, Jerry Jeudy, and players coming out in support of Russell Wilson, which is something you always like to see. I know we'll touch on that. But today, we have Fan Friday, where Broncos country sent in some of their biggest questions with 2 games remaining on the season. You get this every Friday on Locked On Broncos. I have a feeling we're going to talk about a lot, but I think one of the more important questions that's aimed around this episode comes in from our good friend NewType_JK47 on Twitter. He asked the question, will the Broncos overhaul their offensive philosophy and how they look at it? An example being hell-bent on the West Coast offense since 2015 and the quarterback having to fit the system, even if the skills don't mesh with it. Another being the offensive line being great in the run, but terrible in pass pro. I think this is a great question. Will the Broncos overhaul their philosophy? Do you think that's something that's on the cards for them next year?
I think in a way, we're definitely going to see that, and maybe in multiple ways, right? I think when you have a quarterback like Russell Wilson, and Cody, I'm just going to go on the record as saying I'm pretty positive, 99.9%, because you never say never. I'm 99.9% sure that Russell Wilson will be the starting quarterback of the Denver Broncos. I know there's a lot of things being thrown out there, but what does that mean in terms of like overhauling your offensive system? Well, I think that what we expected from Nathaniel Hackett, based on what we had seen from him and the Green Bay Packers the last couple of years. Remember in the offseason, we talked a lot about how they had given so many touches, I think it was like 500 combined touches to both Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon the year prior. And he has done that kind of throughout the course of his time in the NFL. You go back to Buffalo when he had like C.J. Spiller and Fred Jackson, or Jacksonville when he had T.J. Yeldon and whoever else there. So that was kind of a consistent thing for him to get the backs involved. But remember, George Payton, when he talked at his press conference after they fired Nathaniel Hackett, he talked about how the running game was kind of there one week, not there the next week, really inconsistent in the running game. And I think that's absolutely something the Broncos need to emphasize with their next coach that comes in. I think Russell Wilson, the way that he plays the best, you get him on those play action rollouts. You get him out in space where he can launch the ball 60 yards downfield. You give him those opportunities to get outside the pocket. And of course, there's questions abound about, his athleticism. Did injuries play a factor in this season? And I tend to think that they maybe have. So I think, Cody, you do have to kind of maybe overhaul the offensive system from that vantage point. What we expected was a team that ran the ball well, ran the wide zone often, and did those type of things that we see from the Shanahan offense, the Kubiak offense. So it's not that they're necessarily hell-bent on that kind of offense, but it does seem to suit what Russell Wilson does best. So I think you have to overhaul it in terms of we didn't really see that a lot. And in my opinion, I wasn't out there thinking, man, I love watching Russ do the same things that we used to see Jake Plummer do, or John Elway. I wasn't thinking that watching the game, So I think that definitely an overhaul of the offensive system, which will make it interesting to see who they bring in for head coaching interviews and what kind of philosophies those guys have in their background, what they pitch going forward. That's going to be something to watch for sure.
Well, and I think as well, remember when Hackett said that this offense that we were going to see with Denver was going to be reminiscent of the John Elway, Rod Smith, and Terrell Davis. You're going to see the play action, outside zone, setting things up off the bootleg. Sayre, we didn't see that this year. This was not in the Broncos' arsenal at all. And I think, to me, that's probably what's most disappointing looking back. So I do think that the offense, maybe the philosophy does have to be overhauled a bit. I'll be intrigued to see who can come in and kind of revolutionize what the Broncos have, because at the skill player position, they do have weapons, as we have seen. So that is a great question sent in from newtype_JK47. Our next one comes in from Peter Nova, Supernova38 on Twitter, says, from the last 2 George Paton draft classes, if you had to predict who will be on the roster next season, or is there any surprise cuts you think we will see this team make prior to to next season? To be honest with you, Sayre, looking at George Paton's draft classes, 7+ starters. We imagine Caden Stearns will be the starter opposite of Justin Simmons next season. That's pretty damn good for these last 2 draft classes. Now, granted, Denver didn't have that first. They had a late second-round pick from the Von Miller trade, which ended up being Nick Bonito, who's still kind of going through the developmental process as is. George Paton's drafts have been pretty damn good, Sayre.
Yeah, they really have, Cody. You talk about 7 starters and 2 classes. That's a pretty good hit rate. Even if some of these guys are starting because you trade Noah Fant, you bring in Greg Dulcich and really nobody else. He's kind of starting by default in that way, but also not really. So I think that you look up and down the list of draft picks, Pat Surtain, Javonte Williams, Quinn Miners, Baron Browning, like his top 4 and arguably top 5 if you include Caden Stearns from that 2021 class. Those top 5 picks are going to be starters and key players for you next season. And I think then you look at this year's draft class, obviously Nick Bonito, Greg Dulcich, Damari Mathis, Iyomo Uwazurike, those picks in the top 4 rounds. I think you could see potentially all 9 of those guys in the starting lineup at some point. Matt Henningsen as well. He plays a lot. Montreal Washington, do you consider him a starter as he's the kick and punt returner, I guess? He's a significant contributor in that regard. So certainly the surprise cut variety, Cody, I don't necessarily know. I don't know that anyone will be a surprising cut, because I don't necessarily see, like, Montreal Washington would be, to me, the one name that would stand out there is like, whoa, man, you were relying on him to be your top kick and punt returner, and then all of a sudden you cut him the next year. That wouldn't be super surprising to me, because you look at this draft class from 2022, how much input did the coaches have in some of these picks? I think we're going to find out just how much input these coaches had that are on the current staff or were on the current staff in terms of this year's draft class and just what they asked for during the draft process. So to me, do I see any real surprise cuts? I don't know. I don't really see anybody being a surprising cut, Cody. I don't know if you agree with me on that. Jonathan Cooper, I think he's played well enough for 2 seasons now to stick around. So, he would be a surprise cut to me, but I don't necessarily see that happening.
Yeah, I don't see that happening either, especially seeing what we have from him and his small sample size of getting on the field, and for him to play how he's played as a 7th-round pick. There's a lot of value in that. So, we'll have our eyes on the future on that. I think a lot about who the new coach will be. I think we'll have a big say on that. Who they bring in, who they decide to keep from the current coaching staff, I think also plays a major role in this. So it's hard to project right now, but, good so far, good classes here from George Paton, despite the amount of hate he's getting about the Russell Wilson trade. Hindsight should not be used as a weapon, folks. But hopefully George Paton can learn from the whole trade fiasco, the hiring of Nathaniel Hackett, so many other circumstances. Outside of that, don't let that negative situation about that impact the way that you view George Paton in a bigger picture scheme, because so far the moves he has made from a roster standpoint, pretty damn good, considering also free agency, Alex Singleton, K'Wan Williams, and other guys of that nature. So I think that deserves to be highlighted here on the show. But Fan Friday continues here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country sent in their questions, and we answered the best ones on today's episode of the show, including, could Jerry Rosburg be a potential head coaching candidate in this upcoming cycle? That's a question we get asked. We'll get to that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But today's episode of the show is brought to you by NHTSA. And did you know that driving high is considered driving under the influence? That's right. Driving under the influence of marijuana is against the law in every state, even states where marijuana is legal. That means driving high could get you a DUI. And if you think law enforcement officers can't tell when you're driving high, you're wrong. Your friends can tell, your coworkers can tell, even your parents can tell. Everyone can tell. So what makes you think law enforcement officers don't know when you're driving high? Driving under the influence of marijuana can slow your response time and change how you perceive time and speed. So even if you think you're fine to drive when you're high, you're not. Because the bottom line is, if you feel different, you drive different. And driving high is driving under the influence. So remember, drive high, get a DUI, paid for by NHTSA. Could Denver Broncos interim head coach Jerry Rosburg throw his name into the hat of potential coaching candidates for the job in 2023? Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre, man, Broncos Country is always coming in clutch with some of these amazing questions we get to dive a little bit deeper into. So just a reminder, if you ever want to be involved in Fan Friday, on Thursdays, we'll put a tweet out for you to respond to. We'll add the questions into our list, and you have a chance to have it featured here on air. Also, make sure you drop your comments down below. We always appreciate the interaction and discussion from everybody in Broncos Country. Before we get into the question about Jerry Rosburg being a potential head coaching candidate for the Broncos as he serves as the interim right now, Kinley G sent in a really good question here on Twitter. He asked the question, do you think that we move on from KJ Hamler? Would you think that Paris Campbell could be a free agent target for us? Could we possibly draft edge rusher with the first round pick? Some good questions here. First off, I really want to talk about the KJ Hamler one, right? And I think a lot of people's frustration about KJ Hamler, Broncos fans, is that, okay, well, he's injured. He hasn't been able to play. Keep in mind, this is a guy who came back in under a year from a major ACL surgery reconstruction on top of a hip injury that caused him to lose 75 pounds, Sayre. He was able to come back for training camp. He was on a little bit of a pitch count, and he just was never fully right? Because in the hip, you have scar tissue. And so for KJ, he's just trying to get back to being himself 100%, which is what the Broncos essentially decided. Like, KJ wanted to play. KJ has wanted to play, the last 3 or 4 weeks here, Sayre. But, the reality is Denver wants him to be 100% fully healthy going into next season. So they shut him down a little bit early. But now he's going to come into training camp here in 2023, Sayre. He's going to be fully healthy, which will be a good thing for him. I can't wait to see how it all kind of pays out. But I don't think moving on from KJ Hamler is the right move. As we have seen this year, Sayre, and I'm eager for your thoughts on this, anytime he's touched the football, like, explosive plays have happened, right? We're talking about plays of over 20-plus yards downfield, explosive plays. There is value. And in clutch time, remember the Jacksonville game? I don't think I need to say any more on that. KJ, I think, is a special talent. I know a lot of fans are frustrated. He hasn't been able to play much. Injuries are part of the game. He understands that, but I can tell you nobody's as frustrated about not being able to play as KJ Hamler. This was a move that came from the organization at the top level, shutting him down for the year, saying, we want to get you fully right for next year. So don't take it out on KJ Hamler, folks. There was some perspective there. But, Sayre, I want to kind of go to your point. Another part of his question here, he asked, could we possibly draft edge rusher with the first-round pick? I'm kind of staying away from the projecting free agency and draft right now because I think we really have to know who the head coach is before we can really make that kind of assumption as to maybe what Denver will do.
Right. I think you're absolutely right on that. And you look at the draft prospects available in this class, you can kind of get a good idea of where the depth is at or where the top heavy positions are early on as guys start to opt out of their bowl games and such. And you can see that the edge position is slowly but surely developing into one of the better positions. So it's understandable that I think people are looking at that late first round pick coming back from the 49ers and saying, well, the best case scenario for the Broncos may be an edge player at that spot. And that may be the case. And I'm not opposed to that. I'm not opposed to anything. Like I said earlier, 99.9%. I'll never say never on anything. I would be surprised, Cody. In my opinion, it would be surprising unless you're talking about somebody that plays kind of, hand in the dirt sort of role. If you lose like a Draymond Jones in free agency, that's the kind of player that maybe, player that could be like a hybrid there. But like you said, it all depends so much on who's going to be even coaching this team going forward, what their philosophy is, where the Broncos are going to allocate resources in free agency, because we don't know that right now. They could go out and they could grab a couple of really, solid, cheap options as depth on the D line and off the edge and go into the draft with another focus, right? So we don't necessarily know that to be the case. We can tell right now. There's the reason you're talking about edge right now is because that's a pretty deep position. You feel like you can maybe get the best bang for your buck there in the late first round. So I get that from a philosophy standpoint. I like that process. To me, if it's up to me, I'm kind of like, I'm usually the complete opposite of this, Cody, and you know this. I'm kind of like offense or bust right now for the Broncos. I don't even necessarily care what position it is. If it's a tight end, that would be maybe a little bit over the top, but sure, go for it. Anybody that can make the offense better, even the interior offensive line. Like normally that would bore me as a first round option. If the best guy there is an interior offensive lineman, I say go for it. So I'm kind of offense or bust. I think the Broncos have so many good pieces defensively, especially with all you've invested in off the edge. You have to, like, I think I've said this one time before, but it bears repeating. The Broncos have invested so much in guys like, even Randy Gregory, but also you change Baron Browning's positions. You use your top pick in 2022 on Nick Bonito. You're 2 years into Jonathan Cooper's development. I don't think you just look at their 2022 season and say, all right, this is what these guys are forever. They can't sit the edge like Bradley Chubb, so we need to go draft somebody else. You have to bank on your coaches and your player development. You have to bank on that actually happening. You have to bank on these guys progressing, getting better. You can't just throw a first-round pick at a position because you traded away your best guy at that spot. That's not really how it works, especially because the reason you traded Chubb is because you like the guys behind it, right? So I think you have to develop those guys. I personally, unless it's like a top 5, top 10 player, I would absolutely be team offense at this point in round 1 of the draft.
Well, we've had some people asking us, when are you going to do a mock draft, folks? I'm telling you, I'm not going to do a mock draft till after free agency, so please don't ask me. I know it's going to be something people are passionate about, but there's so much, like, for example, knowing who the head coach is, knowing who the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator is for this team, the philosophy. We'll find out a little bit more from that standpoint. So it's going to be a while before you get a mock draft from me, folks, but I digress here. Now we have one coming in from Daniel Lutz, really kind of talking about Jerry Rosburg here. He asked the question, knowing that Broncos ownership is going to say that they're going to do an extremely thorough and deep vetting process for our next head coach, but do you believe this is a mini audition or a pre-interview for Rosburg, and what are the expectations for the next 2 games with him as a coach? Sayre, I don't get the impression, like, obviously for Rosburg to step in and do what he's doing, you have to applaud him, right? And I like a lot of the stuff that he has said. But I think the reality of the situation is I don't see him being the next head coach for this Denver Broncos football team. Now, so much to say is that, let's say Denver comes out and they look really damn good in these next 2 games against the Chiefs and the Chargers, and they win both, decent or convincingly. Maybe it changes a little bit, but overall, I still think that there could be a chance for Rosburg to have a role at the franchise. Heck, potentially even setting himself up for special teams coordinator going into next season. A lot of that's going to come from George Payton. It's going to come from ownership as well. They believe that they needed an identity there. He could be the perfect guy for that, considering how much he's expressed he's loved Colorado. But how he does there, I think, will be a big telling factor. What are your quick thoughts on this question here from Daniel?
Yeah, I love the question. I think that obviously you listen to Jerry Rosburg and you kind of hear a guy that seems ready for this type of role. And specifically what I'm talking about is the interim head coach role. Like, he seems like he's going to be able to get everybody's poop in a group here for these last 2 games. And I like what I'm hearing from him. But at the same time, I think the Broncos are going to be shooting for the stars for this next head coaching position that they're going to be. I think they're going to go really, really big. And not to say that that's no disrespect to Jerry Rosburg, but I think that they're going to try to find a solution at the head coaching spot that is going to be a decade-long thing, not like these last 2 games of 2022 went really well. Let's see where things go in 2023. I don't think that's the position they're in. I think they're going to be shooting for the stars, and I think Jerry Rosburg, maybe even not if, I think if he does a good job, Cody, he could have a spot on this staff, like you mentioned, maybe special teams coordinator, maybe assistant head coach / special teams. Maybe, there's a number of different options there for him, but I think he's probably, after what we've seen this last year, the responsibilities that he's just been given, I would be shocked if he didn't want to come back to Denver next year, especially if things end well here this season.
It's going to be a very interesting offseason, Sayre, and one thing is for sure, I'm excited to break down all the chaos with you and everybody in Broncos country. That's a great question sent in by Daniel Lutz. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your question here. But, another question we're going to get to, obviously, on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. Should the Broncos invest in the trenches in the NFL draft? We'll dive into this from a philosophical standpoint. You'll get that on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. But this episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You get the latest odds and trends from every professional and amateur league that's out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball and World Cup. We've got it all at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and the easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Should the Broncos invest in the trenches in the NFL draft? There's still so much that has to happen between now and the NFL draft to have a real clear identity as to what the Broncos will do. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. We appreciate you so much, whether you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you're watching us handsome dudes in 4K high definition on your smartphone, your computer, or your television. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us. Greg Pabin sends in this question, says, I see this year's draft as the time to build the O-line and the D-line up because we are thin in the depth department. Do you agree? To Greg's point, Sayre, I agree that offensive line, defensive line, maybe offensive line more so than D-line. I feel like the Broncos' defensive line depth has actually been pretty solid so far this year. You're seeing a lot from Inyoma Uwazurike stepping up. You're seeing it from Matt Henningsen stepping up, Deshaun Williams, Jonathan Harris. Right now, I'm not as worried about defensive line depth. However, offensive line depth, considering the offense is the biggest issue with this team, probably all in on the offensive line being something they need to invest in free agency and the NFL draft.
Well, I think you want to see that, absolutely, and that's going to be like almost like a PR thing for the Denver Broncos, right? It's like if you don't address the offensive line, like what's the fan base going to be saying all throughout the course of the offseason? That is one of the number one areas of need for this team. I kind of tend to think, Cody, I'm not going to predict that the Broncos don't invest in the offensive line. Certainly, I think they're going to do that. But at the same time, you fire Butch Barry here with a couple of weeks left in the season. It makes you wonder and maybe makes you even believe or confirms what you already believed and already maybe knew to be true, that the Broncos players are pretty good on the offensive line and the offensive line coach was the problem. So maybe there's something to that, right? Maybe you do bring back Dalton Reisner on a 1-year prove-it deal. Maybe you do bring back someone like Cam Fleming as depth or Calvin Anderson and see what he's got. I don't know exactly what the pro scouting department thinks for the Broncos. I don't know where they're at on some of these guys. You can't bring back Netanya Muti, unfortunately. That's out of the question. But all things considered, I do think the Broncos are going to upgrade on the offensive line. I don't exactly know what that means, but I think free agency first and foremost. The question was specifically about the NFL draft, right? So you probably want to bring in some guys that are proven up on the offensive line, if at all possible. Maybe you swing a trade or two for some interior offensive line help or tackle help. Right tackle, we know, is a position of need for the Broncos, and it has been. I agree with you, though, on the defensive line. I think that you've been really budget-friendly on the D-line for a few years now. Obviously, bring in the big free agent like DJ Jones. He's coming back. Draymond Jones, is he going to get tagged? Will the Broncos now offer him an extension once they know who the next head coach is going to be and have that all in place? So many question marks until we get to the draft, like you said. I mean, I'll do the mock drafting for you, Cody, before free agency, but at the same time, it's like those are just options to get us to the free agency period to find out more about these prospects that are potentially available, rather than to say this guy is the guy the Broncos need, because all of that could change in March.
Yes, it could, and there's going to be a lot of questions about March, right, because free agency, so much can be contingent upon the head coach, which we'll probably find out in the next 3 or 4 weeks who the next head coach for this Broncos team will be, which kind of leads to our next question coming in, our final one here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Hugh Baker, of all the names floating around for the Broncos head coaching search, who are your preferred hires, and who do you think is the most realistic choice for the job? I mean, Sayre, I think there's going to be a multitude of people's names being thrown in the hat. I think that, obviously, everyone's like, oh, Sean Payton. I don't think that's the most realistic hire. I don't think Sean Payton wants to come to Denver. He's got his choice whether or not he does. So I don't think that it's going to be Payton. I think you and I kind of talked about this as well. I feel like the wild card here, the sleeper, is Jim Harbaugh, who's currently coaching, obviously at the University of Michigan. For him, they're in the college football playoffs, have a chance to go to the national championship. If he wins a national championship in Michigan, I could see him leaving, saying, okay, I accomplished what I set out to do at Michigan. Win a national championship, beat Ohio State, obviously being another thing. That's one of those things he sought out for. But for me, it's like there's so many names out there. I think a name to keep an eye on, Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions. Obviously, Greg Penner said that experience isn't necessarily like previous head coaching experience, might I add, not Jeff Saturday experience. I'm not talking about that. The Broncos aren't going to do the Jeff Saturday experience approach, but somebody who hasn't been a head coach before, a first-time head coach, that is still in the realm of possibility, even though the Denver's done that the last 3 times. So it'll be interesting there. Shane Steichen's obviously another name to keep an eye on for what he's been able to do as well as a coordinator. I'll be very intrigued to see where they go. I mean, I have no preference. For me, I think that the real sleeper in the wild card is Jim Harbaugh. Sayre, who is yours?
I would say absolutely it's Jim Harbaugh. And I would say also, too, and not that I think this is going to happen, but I would say don't necessarily sleep on Sean Payton either. I mean, money talks, and I'm going to continue to bring
That's
that up
true.
until he officially turns down the Broncos. They want an audience with him, I'm sure. I'm sure they want to talk to him. If they see him as the best candidate, I'm sure they're going to try to talk to him. Remember when Russell Wilson's initial list of teams that he wanted to be traded to came out, and the New Orleans Saints were on there, and that was
Yeah.
before Sean Payton retired. So it makes you wonder, like, has he already thought about playing for Sean Payton? Have his reps already reached out to Sean Payton's rep about him playing for him? So it makes you wonder those type of things. But at the same time, realistically, I don't necessarily know that to be the case, Cody, but I also don't know how much money the Broncos are willing to offer somebody like Sean Payton or Jim Harbaugh or Frank Reich to come in. I think there's a huge misconception about this. We're going to talk about this more as the next couple of weeks progress, right? But the huge misconception right now is that the Broncos' job is unappealing. I think to a degree it may be, but at the same time, you can't help but think that these teams that have the vacancies at the quarterback position, maybe a little bit more, roster flexibility in terms of not having Russell Wilson on their roster, right? These teams are all looking ahead at the 2024 NFL draft. I don't think anybody has two eyes on the 2023 NFL draft in terms of the quarterback class. So having the best quarterback prospects available in 2024 makes the Broncos' job all the more intriguing because you're talking about, I mean, it's going to be competitive out there in terms of financially. I don't see the Broncos as an unattractive job. I see it as you have a shot in 2023 with Russ. Just like, remember, Vic Fangio, not that he was playing with house money, but George Payton more so was playing with house money the first year with Vic Fangio, right? It's not like George Payton is going to be judged on his 1 year with Vic Fangio. No, we're going to judge this next head coach that comes in for the Denver Broncos, not based on what they do with Russell Wilson in 2023, but perhaps what's to come after. That's job security beyond this year. I think that the Broncos will offer that. I don't see the job as unattractive to somebody like Sean Payton, to somebody like Jim Harbaugh. I see that as being a huge advantage to them of saying, we'll do what you can with Russ in 2023. We'd love it if he gets better. If not, we'll go all in on your favorite guy in the 2024 draft.
I feel you, my friend. There's going to be a lot of interesting things coming up as it pertains to this Broncos offseason, whoever the coach may be. Broncos Country, let us know in the YouTube comment section down below who you prefer to be the head coach for the Denver Broncos in 2023. Thank you so much for all your questions here on Fan Friday. We're going to have you covered all throughout the weekend, including the Broncos postgame report and Sunday's matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. You can expect that here on your favorite audio podcasting platform or on YouTube. We'll see you then for the Locked On Broncos postgame report.